Oh, God, yeah.
Sir, you're live on YouTube.
I'm alive.
You're live.
I'm alive. You're live. Wait, you can plug it up. Can you switch the doors? Jenny.
Jenny, Jose, and you said we're online. Jenny might just have her camera off. But she was on the video. She was there, she's disappeared.
Okay, well, we're gonna get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to council workshop for April 23rd, 2024. The time is, I don't know what time.
11 o'clock. 11 o'clock.
Exactly 11 o'clock, look at that. As we have a quorum, I'll call the meeting to order. Always like to start the meeting off in a good way by acknowledging that the city of Maple Ridge carried out its business on the traditional and unceded territories of the Métis First Nation and the Kwantlen First Nation. Madam Clerk, did you want to jump in with anything? No. Okay, we're going to move on to the next item. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda, please? Moved and seconded. Any additions or comments? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Can I get a motion to adopt the minutes of April 9th, 2024? Moved by Councilor Carrera, seconded by Councilor Schiller. Comments, questions? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And now we're going to move on to item 5.1, Maple Ridge Housing Strategy, draft roadmap, and we have a presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. Before we hand it over to the presentation, I'd just like to take a moment and kind of set the stage of where we are today in our journey on the housing conversation. So this is very much a continuation of some of the conversations that we've been before you recently to have. So as council may remember, we are obligated to update our housing needs report by the end of this year. And then from there, we are identifying a number of actions and strategies that the city can take to kind of further that housing conversation in terms of capacity, access, and affordability throughout the community. So while we are waiting for the housing needs regulations piece to be finalized, we're taking this opportunity with you today to have a bit of a deep dive into what types of actions and strategies that are being considered for Maple Ridge, and particularly to hear your comments and questions on what this might look like. So today, to walk us through the roadmap, we have Matt from Urban Matters and Jack from Urban Systems to kind of walk through the report, and I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Mayor and Council. We have a short presentation today and then time for questions. So as Amanda has noted, this is a draft strategy and we are seeking input, questions and comments from Council today. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background on the strategy, spend a minute or two talking about typical roles of local government when it comes to housing, as well as some emerging roles. And then a little bit of the analysis that we've done. We have 5 key strategy areas in the draft roadmap, as well as some potential bigger moves. But to support this work, we've also done some preliminary land economics analysis and some preliminary OCP analysis that is looking at ensuring that the city is conforming to longer term OCP requirements, and that aligns with some of what we think will be coming out of the regulations for the housing needs report. So I'm going to spend just a minute or two here talking about some of the background, and then we'll dive into some of the draft actions and strategies. So we had presented earlier this year to Council, noting that some of the key findings, Maple Ridge is experiencing growth and is projected to see over 10,000 new households over the next roughly 10 years. We do anticipate that this will continue to be driven by owner households, but with a growing proportion of new renters as well. So they will account for an increasing number of households in Maple Ridge. We also know that housing costs in Maple Ridge, as across the region and really across southern British Columbia, have increased significantly at a higher rate than we see median incomes increasing. So there's a growing gap between the cost of housing in Maple Ridge and across the region in comparison to incomes. We also know that there is a tight rental market with low vacancy rates consistently below what is considered healthy, that is that range of 3 to 5% as a vacancy rate. It's generally accepted as being healthy. And we also know that a lot of the purpose-built rental in Maple Ridge is older. That is, nearly 2 out of, or more than 2 out of 5 in every unit was built prior to 1981. So what this really means is we're setting the stage for a future in which the cost of ownership is increasingly challenging in a sort of single family context. So looking at density, whether that's townhome or condominium or other forms of multiplex, becomes an option for increasing affordability. That the need for increased rentals in order to meet the needs of residents is going to go up, and even just address kind of current tightness in the rental market. But with that will come some of the challenges that we know can come along with the redevelopment of the purpose-built market rental sector. And so that, those sort of sets of high-level issues. Of course, the housing needs report will delve into a lot more detail on the demographic front and on the housing front, but these are kind of some key takeaways that are driving some of the strategies and actions that we've identified. So, taking a step back, when we think about the role of local government in housing, there are a number of common municipal roles. Some of these are roles that municipalities have had for decades, including facilitating development through planning and approvals. That's very much an entrenched and longstanding role of local government. Regulating or incentivizing needed forms of housing. Increasingly, we see local governments investing in housing, typically through land contributions. That's the way that most local governments will get involved. In some cases, there may be grant programs as well, although it's hard to kind of match the capital spending that's required to build new affordable housing or new forms of housing, particularly when senior government now in recent years has stepped up in ways to invest through financing and capital in affordable housing and purpose-built rental market. Of course, local government plays a strong role in advocating for further resources and partnering to support or to facilitate new housing. And that can look like partnerships with the nonprofit sector, partnerships with senior government, and even working with the development community, because of course they have a really significant role to play in the development of new units. There are some areas that we are seeing action on in local governments that are what we call emerging roles. These are not necessarily well-established roles or responsibilities, but they're things that local governments are starting to think about taking on. These include developing land acquisition or land partnership strategies. A good example of that is the city of Kelowna, who is currently working on allocating potentially a few city-owned sites, but developing them in such a way that there's a sustainable revenue source that can then fund future land acquisition. So thinking about kind of the sustainability of these tools. Community land trusts and housing authorities are increasingly something that local governments are looking at. The city of Kamloops has recently incorporated a community land trust. The city of Burnaby is in the process of incorporating their housing authority. Both of these serve as arm's length sort of development partnership groups. And so those are areas that, with the exception of the Whistler Housing Authority and Vancouver's Affordable Housing Authority, generally have not been the purview of municipalities. So this is a new area of focus. Again, not a lot of evaluation or outcomes, but interesting to see the direction that these local governments are taking. And then, of course, we have some new development financial tools, updates to the development community or development cost charges, and amenity cost, the new amenity cost charge tool that's been delivered through legislation. So these are areas where local governments are still learning about how to implement or embrace the changes that have been proposed. As part of our work, we've also undertaken some preliminary OCP analysis. And for council's benefit, just to make clear, while the housing regulations for housing needs reports have not been released yet, what we do know is that they're going to require a prescribed calculation for how many units a community will require over the next 20 years. And that will consist of future growth projections, current underlying need, things like core housing need, homelessness, suppressed household formation. So all of these things together will come up with a number that essentially says you need this many more units in order to meet that prescribed calculation. So what you can see here is some of this early work that we've done to assess your OCP, in addition to some of the new changes to transit-oriented areas and the small-scale multi-unit housing, show that under the existing OCP capacity, there are nearly 81,000 potential units available. And currently there are 33,600 existing units. So that means under the current OCP, there's room for over 47,000 new units. When you layer on the transit-oriented areas and the small scale multi-unit housing, that amount increases to 114. The total capacity increases to 114,000 total potential units, which allows for over 80,000 net new units. So based on what we know about the province, and again, the HNR regulations have not been released, but what we do know about them is that this very much positions Maple Ridge to be, you're already on track to meet and exceed that 20-year OCP capacity based on the preliminary calculations that we've done. So this really raises the question, it's not so much about OCP capacity then in Maple Ridge, it's about how to drive forward development, and in particular, the desired forms of development that the city would like to see. One of the things that it's hard to speculate on, but we're in a very challenging economic environment right now for new developments, and some of the land slides that we'll be looking at in a few minutes get into this. But with the current interest rate environment, cost of labor and cost of construction materials, we're not anticipating that the small scale multi-unit housing will lead to a blitz or an immediate sort of uptake. We would anticipate that instead that would sort of be rolled out over the next 20 to 30 years, where we would see a slow redevelopment of single family neighborhoods, rather than what happened in Kelowna when they first rolled out their density, is it was all focused around the downtown core. So highly desirable areas, close proximity to transit, highly walkable. And so for those 400 units or 400 lots or 800 lots, the speculation and the uptake was very quick. Because this has now been rolled out across the province as a whole, we anticipate that developers are going to be a lot slower to kind of pick and choose the areas that they want to see that small scale development. Where we may see more development is around the transit-oriented areas because of the pre-zoning and the boosts in density that we've seen, and the other sort of waivers of things like parking regulations the province has allowed. But what that indicates to us is that for Maple Ridge, and the transit-oriented areas and the corridors of growth around low heat are going to be the primary drivers of growth over the next 10 years or so, with Smooth and filling in some of the gaps and providing a little bit more support and diversity to the housing stock as those sites are picked up. And I think the one thing I'd add is that we would really not anticipate that new subdivisions are going to be like subdivisions that have been developed, but within the last 5 or 10 years, where there's new housing stock are probably not going to be the first ones that are redeveloped. It's going to be older single family stock.
We just take a pause for a moment. We've got a lot of numbers in front of us. I just want to take a moment and ask council if they have any questions about the capacity assessment on this, knowing we still have more to cover. But I just want to make sure we're all okay and we understand what that is. We got Jenny, Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand that as the mayor said. So existing OCP capacity, 80, can you just walk through what we mean by total potential units, existing units and net new?
Sure.
Can you just define those terms for me?
The 80,000 number is the total under current and existing land use, the total maximum number of units that you could see under your existing OCP. So that's not the number of units in Maple Ridge right now. That's if everything was built out to the fullest extent of its allowed land use, it would hit sort of that 80,856 number.
Right. So you're saying that the existing units we have, the 80,000 is existing units we have that are already built up, plus the total potential that we can have with
no,
the
sorry, the existing number is the 33,000.
I see.
33,000 existing units in Maple Ridge as of today,
Okay.
or the best available data that we have through the GIS.
Right.
And then the total capacity of the current OCP is over 80,000. So that means that you could effectively double the number of units without changes to the OCP. And that doesn't account for the transit-oriented areas or the additional capacity or density offered through SMOO.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so, and maybe one more clarification, just to make sure, and, what that means is that our estimates, once you add the transit-oriented areas and the small scale, is that the total capacity or the maximum total number of units Maple Ridge could see would be 114,000 units. So that's an addition of about, between those two things, an addition of about 35,000 new units, capacity.
Sorry, Mayor, if you allow me to jump in here, I just want to make sure I understand that second bit of information that's just given. So 47,000, just going back to the third bullet point, 47,000 net new units that's under OCP, existing OCP with no provincial legislation changes. And then when we add in the new provincial legislation changes, we've gotten another 80,000 units that have just been made possible. So what we're looking at is, what I'm confused about is 47K plus 80K, it doesn't make 114K. So, what am I missing here?
That's a good point. That may be an issue with them.
80 plus 33.
Yes, thank you, Amanda. It's 80 plus the 33. So the 80,000 is unbuilt but potentially existing in the future, and the 33,000 is what we have now. So when you add those two together, then you get the 114,000.
I see. Okay, the 80,000 number is what is possible under existing OCP, plus the as outlined in the presentation, plus the transit-oriented areas, plus the SSMUH, the small scale, the 4 to 6 units per lot. And then the 114K number at the bottom is the units that we currently exist that have already been built, plus the potential net new.
Exactly.
So that's unbuilt and built.
That's
okay,
correct.
now I think I'm good. Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks, Councilor Perez.
Quick question around like the OCP plus the transit-oriented plus, what are we calling it? SMOO? SMOO?
Yes, yeah. Terrible acronym, but yeah.
I don't know.
Better than saying all the letters.
Yeah. We do love our acronyms, don't we? So my question is, how do you calculate that? Like the TOA is fairly easy to calculate, but the SMOO is something that I think for me as a counselor is what I'm struggling with. And how do you calculate that? Is it just a blanket? This is the entire opportunity of where people are going to do? Because where I'm struggling is in the outskirts, right? Like we don't want to be having 4 units on a lot that's not serviced by transit or facilities or anything. And then this doesn't take into account, because I think under the legislation, there's the ability to have exclusions based on geography and risk, right?
Right.
So that doesn't take into account if we as a city meet one of the criteria for an exclusion?
So what we've excluded through this analysis, there's a few layers that we've gotten from the city's GIS department.
Thanks.
So servicing is a requirement. If you're not on city water and sewer, then you're excluded automatically.
Yeah.
So that accounts for this, or this analysis accounts for that. We've excluded any ALR, obviously, and excluded floodplain development too. So that's one area where I think we've tried to be cautious around geographic risk. The one piece of remaining analysis that I think we need to drill down on a little bit is transit frequency, because right now we've assumed this sort of ideal scenario of transit frequency, which allows for a little bit more density on some of the single family lots that actually may be only serviced every hour or so. So we have a little bit more work in terms of refining the figures and understanding transit frequency to some of those more outlying areas through this work.
And then I guess some of it is within the urban containment boundary where they do have hookup, because I am talking within the urban containment boundary, because I know that it really doesn't apply to those acre plus lots. It doesn't apply to sort of our ALR or outlying areas, but we do have areas that do not have facilities like transit to support a community. And it also, does it take into account, like, because we have large lots and a lot of sort of greenfield area that are being bought up and subdivided, I mean, how do you, like, if you take it, like, how do you take that? Because that's this really unknown piece for us, right?
Yeah.
So how does that calculate?
It is an unknown, and we can't factor in anything more than what we have under the existing layers of the GIS. Yeah. So whatever zones and lots are kind of currently recorded is what we use for the analysis. I will say that I think what's really important is that through this analysis, I think that we're seeing that the city is actually orders of magnitude above where it needs to be for its OCP calculation. So even if these numbers waver by a few thousand, you're still going to be well above where we think that the province is heading with its regulations on HNRs.
There's lots of room.
There's lots of room, and there's lots of room. Again, I think, circle back to my earlier comment, what this means is that the city has power through its policies and incentives and regulations to direct growth where growth is desired. So, I mean, the market will take care of the SMU in many ways, but then for the other areas, for greater density, that's where your policy levers are gonna be really impactful.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it is good to know that we do have some. I feel a little bit like our powers have been, like the rug's been pulled out from underneath of us, and our ability to direct where that density is going to be built, because there's areas that make total sense in our community and other areas that don't. So if there are areas that we, to have some levers to still control that,
Yeah, and that's, I mean, maybe just to flip to the next slide here, you can see, the sort of transit-oriented areas get a lot denser. So this is the additional TOA capacity map. So you can see that grows, but then the question becomes, for the growth corridor along Lougheed, what are the policies? And so this is what we're going to be making some recommendations on in the strategy, is what the land economics shows us is viable and desirable and leads to better housing outcomes in those areas that aren't TOA but are neighboring on them, or that are also slated for growth. And so that's where we kind of get into some discussion of the incentives and the regulations.
Okay. I've seen any other questions from that previous slide, where we're good on this now, right? Okay, please continue.
Thank you very much. So moving into the strategy development, as I mentioned earlier, we have 5 strategies and then a number of potential big moves. So the first strategy that we've identified is to prioritize needed forms of housing. And what this really looks at is like, what are the tools that local government has to incentivize the development of particular forms of housing, whether they be affordable housing or purpose-built rental, or even denser forms of market ownership. And so what we've done is kind of identified these 4 key issues. So what are the incentive programs that can be put in place? And incentives, we could probably spend a long time talking about what those are, but these include land contributions, density bonusing, parking reductions, fast tracking approvals, waiving DCCs and reduced or expedited design requirements. We are looking at an analysis of reviewing and expanding the existing density bonusing policy. So I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment.
There's a problem, yes.
We're also going to be doing a little bit of testing on determining the feasibility of implementing inclusionary zoning. So this is a new power that the province has just announced. We don't even have the policy guide out for it. But what we do know is that density bonusing and inclusionary zoning are sort of opposite sides of the same coin, in that density bonusing is a carrot and inclusionary zoning is a stick. Both of them can achieve either contributions to affordable housing reserves or contributions of units, but density bonusing does it through an incentive-based approach, and inclusionary zoning does it through a requirements-based approach. So we're going to be testing both of these and seeing the impact that they might have on development, particularly in the growth corridors for Maple Ridge. And then finally, one of the proposed recommendations is updating the revitalization tax exemption program. So what does this all mean in terms of the development finance? We've got a couple of preliminary slides here, which show some of our initial testing. So the first slide is going to look at strata or condominium development, and the second one looks at purpose-built rental. So our land economics team has been testing a few select variables or incentives that can be applied, just to understand how they impact current market conditions. So you'll see on the left here, we've got 2 scenarios. One is called current market conditions, and the second one is improved market conditions. So we know that interest rates are very high right now, but we're also getting signals from the Bank of Canada that they may be lowered later this year. And so we've created a scenario that operates under existing interest rates, and one that uses a 4% interest rate, which might be what we see in a couple of years if inflation stays down. And each scenario, so you can see there are 5 scenarios across the bottom. And each scenario is kind of stacked to give you a sense of how much it improves the viability or the affordability of the project. So just so you understand what the threshold there on the left is, that's the profit anticipated in terms of percentage points. And so typically when a bank or a private financer is looking to finance a project, they're looking for a minimum of 15 points or 15% return, rate of return on their investment. And so anything below about 15% means it's not a viable project. The developer can't get financing for it. And so we can see that if there are no levers applied right now, even under a favorable financing, like an improved interest rate scenario, developers may not be able to move forward with the project. But once you start moving some of these levers and particularly combining them, in particular, you can see that the parking reductions has the biggest impact. That's one of the things that we've seen in the transit-oriented areas. Then all of a sudden it starts to move the dial. Now, we're not necessarily proposing that all these incentives be applied to market ownership units. We just wanted to kind of demonstrate that in a baseline scenario, if you're developing a set of market condominiums, that these are the sort of rates of return that you have to contend with. We'll move to our next slide, but maybe then I'll pause as well to see if there are questions.
Add something here because now are these condos or these
Condominiums.
not rentals?
No, the next slide is rentals. Yeah.
Strata.
We'll
So-
be able to get a copy of this presentation.
Absolutely.
For council.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see.
Yeah, apologies if that's small. I think in terms of the purpose-built rental scenarios, it's also a challenging time. It's always been challenging to build purpose-built rentals. In Canada, we've had a lack of them over the last 30 years, which is one of the drivers of the current housing crisis that we're in. But what we can see here is that there are a combination of things that local governments and senior governments can do in order to strengthen the delivery of purpose-built rental into a community. So again, you see on the left there is a scenario in which no levers are applied. And that, if there were no incentives and no favorable financing, then in the current market conditions, there would only be a 2% rate of return on a purpose-built rental, and that goes up to a 4% rate of return under a better interest rate scenario. So it's really, sorry.
Hold on, we're just gonna try and
Yeah.
move the presentation onto
Yeah.
the side screen.
Okay.
And I just want to pause for a moment because I saw Councillor Tan hand went up. This to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, if we could please go back to the slides about viability, maybe starting the strata one. I'll just give staff a moment there. I think what I was trying to understand was I saw that under the parking reduction, reducing by 40%, that like bumped the viability up. I think it was to 15 to 12 to 17% or something like that, or 15 to 17. And then under the scenario where all the levers were applied, parking and then the other 4 levers identified, it only bumped the viability threshold up by like 2%. Can that be explained to me?
Well, I think what it's telling us is that essentially, the parking is the biggest lever that local government has, but the other ones, if you look, for example, at the fast tracking of development, when we can return to that slide, there's very little difference between a no levers applied and a fast track scenario applied. The same percentages show up. Now, it may be the difference between 8.1 and 8.9% or 8.4%. That's not showing up heavily on the graph. But essentially what it tells us is that fast tracking is not adding a lot in terms of increased viability. The DCCs does increase that accounts for that additional 2%. So you may be able to eke that out, but again, it's not a big impact. So the big impact is coming from the parking reductions. Just because we know that in particular, when you have to go down more than one floor, if you have to do 2 floors of subsurface parking, then that can easily translate to $50,000 or more per stall. So that's a significant cost addition to a development.
I appreciate that, and once we're able to get the slides back, then I'll be able to more clearly reference. I guess like where I'm confused about is so it's good to know that parking reductions are a large help for making a project financially viable. I just want to make sure I understand, because once we put in everything else, I think I'm still a little bit baffled that everything else, the fast tracking, the approvals, the sort of all the other things you identified, can have almost such little impact on the viability of a project. Because if that is the case, then that has significant implications on what kinds of policies we spend the time on putting in. I guess I just want to ask you, maybe just walk us through sort of that methodology that you use to calculate this. You would know this better than me, but can you sort of just walk us through a little bit on this, like how confident we are about these findings?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so this is our land economics team that has developed this, and they've done the analysis for it. Some of the underlying assumptions include that we're looking at the RM3 zoning. And one of the things that we've found about the zoning is that it may not maximize the height. So we're looking at a 5-story apartment or condominium that assumes 46% site coverage, that the parking is 100% underground, that the DCCs were dropped to 0. So again, they account for that additional increase. And then some of the other changes in terms of the expedited approvals piece, the baseline scenario or the no incentive scenario assumes an 18-month development approvals timeline with an increased or expedited approvals timeline of 12 months. Amanda, was there anything else that I missed?
No, I think that covers.
Thank you. I think my 2 last quick questions on this is whether one question we get asked a lot, are these results sort of generalized across the region, or do we have a high level of confidence on Maple Ridge specifically? And the second question I'm going to have around this is like, to what degree do these findings hold for non-market projects? I mean, it's like the banks look for different things, but just help me out here in this one.
Yeah. So I will, happy to talk to that. So yes, we have our land economics team works across Metro Vancouver regularly. They've been speaking with developers in the Maple Ridge community, as well as developers in other communities. We recently undertook some baseline economic analysis for purpose-built rentals, specifically for Metro Vancouver, for a guide that we were developing that shows very much the same trends. It's an incredibly difficult time to be developing new housing right now. And what our analysis, in the Metro Vancouver work, we looked at 3 sites, one North Shore, one Surrey, and I think one in Burnaby. And what that showed is that, in all of those, even in favorable development environments, it's very tough unless you're stacking multiple incentives and accessing potentially CMHC financing to make a purpose-built rental project work. To the point that we've been told by some larger developers that they're just taking a year off from doing development this year. They may be prepping, they may be doing site planning, but they're not actually looking for financing right now because the environment is so challenging. So this testing has gone through the development community in terms of conversations with them, and then other work that we've done that very much aligns with this has been sort of fact-checked and ground truth with the development community as well. So I think we feel fairly confident about what the analysis is showing, again, under current market conditions.
Maybe just to answer one element of Councillor Chan's question, the numbers on this slide are reflective of
Got dropped, folks.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. We just lost council.
We are
Stay tuned.
dropped, obviously.
Stay tuned. We are sorry. The show will resume again soon.
Yeah, but I think what the issue is that the parking thing is universal. It affects every locality, but the most important thing is that location matters, because even within a town, the location of the project, say for example, close to a transit line, say SkyTrain, for example, will because what we are looking at is the marketability of that particular project. So if you have, say, something on Lougheed Highway compared to when you have it in Albion, most people will go for the one that is in Lougheed Highway because of the ease of letting it or leasing it out and so on and so forth. But we're talking about market forces now. But to just make a general statement and say that because it is applicable across board, yes, but again, you have to look at it from the locational point of view, in the sense that what happens in Surrey Central is not going to be the same thing as what happens in Lougheed Highway.
Right.
There's a world of difference, and yet the two of them are still as central, so to speak. But Surrey Central is different from Lougheed Highway or even downtown Maple Ridge.
Right. Right. And isn't it interesting that when we pressed them about this, they said that they feel fairly confident about this for Maple Ridge too. I just wanted to ask about that because sometimes these consultants, they work largely.
Yeah, I get it.
Then we need to.
I'm trying to stop the.
There we go. Okay, I got the stop.
Yes, good morning.
Okay.
Are we now on? Yes.
Just hang on, while I get some talking myself. Can you hear me?
Just water
Yes.
cooler doc.
You can hear me, okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you too having your conversations.
Oh,
Great.
great.
So we all know what happened yesterday.
Okay, we're back.
Back?
Yeah. So Amanda, do you want to repeat what you were just saying when we were?
What pleasure.
Okay, all right, let's bring it back in.
So I think, sorry.
I think we lost the.
Can we go back a couple of slides?
Okay, now we're.
Yeah, one more.
There it is.
So yeah, just to reiterate maybe what was said when there was a cutoff of Zoom. We've done testing across the region, but we've also done specific testing that the testing here is using the zoning and land use for Maple Ridge, the assessment values for Maple Ridge, and using interviews with local developers. And so it is very much in the Maple Ridge context. However, it also aligns with the overall trends that we're seeing across the region. So now that the slide is back up, were there other questions about it?
Do you have a question? Yeah, okay, so we've got Councilor Carrera.
Yeah, just a quick question about waiving the DCCs on strata. I'm not talking about rentals or below market rentals, because I think that's probably more of a priority and a need in our community. Are other communities doing that? I struggle with if we drop municipal DC, I mean, it doesn't make a huge difference, but if we drop the DCCs, which actually pay for the necessary infrastructure, then we're putting it back onto the other homeowners.
We're not necessarily proposing that. This is simply to demonstrate the difference that it makes in the
but
viability.
But are other communities doing
No, not for market, not for market strata. No, I would say that DCCs, ultimately, we can see that it doesn't have a huge impact. So the big levers that local government has is parking. And then the one that we're still in the process of testing that hasn't been completed yet is density bonusing, right? So those are the two areas where you can probably achieve the most impact on a project viability, whether it be a market ownership or a market rental, that is actually going to kind of change the nature of the equation for a
developer. And then on the TOAs, we lose the ability to even have a minimum parking, like that's already implemented in the TOA legislation.
And is one of the major critiques of the legislation that we've seen in terms of removing local government ability to incentivize through things like parking reductions.
Yeah, we've taken away all of these. Anyhow.
Okay, Councilor Tan, but I do want to be mindful of time. So, what did you have?
Yeah, May, feel free to end this portion at any time. I'm curious. I just want to understand if you could elaborate just maybe briefly why fast tracking development approvals like doesn't seem to have much of an impact here. Because I think the assumption I was operating under, and I think we've had a lot of talks around the council table about how important it is to fast track. So can you sort of speak to that?
So the fast track assumption, it assumes only a 6-month improvement in development approvals times and a reduction from 18 months to 12 months. So that's why we're seeing, if you squint really closely, you can actually see that there's a marginal increase, but it's not reflected very well on the slide as it stands right now because the numbers stay the same because it's only a portion of a percentage point that is the increase. But it is about the development approvals of the rezoning. So there may be other ways, for example, pre-zoning that could shift or change and speed up the development approvals time. But we're talking about effectively a rezoning process that is reduced in terms of its timeline. But there are other tools that speed up the development approvals process more significantly, and pre-zoning is mentioned in one of the later strategies that may be able to have more of an impact.
Okay.
I will, so I just maybe very briefly, given the time. So now, can we move forward to the next slide, please?
You should have control now.
Great. So we see the same analysis, effectively the same sets of levers applied to purpose-built rental, and I won't spend too long on this. I will just note that there is one additional component in here, and that's scenario C, which is CMHC's apartment construction loan program. They offer reduced financing rates and a longer amortization period that can actually quite substantially change the equation for developers. And so when we layer that in, that can be a bit of a game changer. And when it's stacked with other incentives as well. The thing about the CMHC program is it requires a component of affordability. So 30% of the units, 30% of the units need to be serving below median income households. So it's not deep affordability. We're not talking about folks on income assistance shelter rates, but we are talking about purpose-built rental that would be delivered, a portion of that would be delivered to a community at below market rate. So I think that's really worth noting. We have not yet gone into a non-market development scenario, but that is on our list to test the BC Housing Community Housing Fund as another model, so that we would have a market, a purpose-built rental, and then a nonprofit scenario.
There's also the GST exempt.
There is, yeah, which I think our team now incorporates into this, and it's one of the things, again.
That's a substantial amount.
It is, and given how challenging it is right now, it's really vital because it helps sometimes push projects across into viability. I'll continue on, and I do just want to note that there are that we will, as part of this work, we'll have a comprehensive land economics memo that will outline all of these scenarios and allow council a bit of an opportunity to kind of dive into this too. So, as there are questions, if they're directed to staff, we can make sure to incorporate feedback into our memo as we develop it. So moving ahead to the remaining strategies. I'd mentioned earlier that the potential for developing existing purpose-built rental, particularly older stock. So to that end, we're looking at strengthening renter protections in Maple Ridge, including, I know the modular home park redevelopment has already gone through, so acknowledging that work has taken place, but updating tenant relocation assistance policies, monitoring the need for strata conversion. This tends to be an older policy, so we're not suggesting that it needs to be done, but it may be something that staff keep an eye on if purpose-built rental is starting to be converted into strata housing. And then exploring the use of RRTZ, the residential rental tenure zoning, in key areas. We've seen municipalities be nervous about using this because it gets a lot of pushback from developers, but there is some innovation. City of Victoria, for example, right now is using RRTZ and density bonusing together. So market development can still be delivered at a base density, but additional density is achieving purpose-built rental, and in some cases some affordability as well. And then that's protected through the application of the residential rental tenure zoning. Strategy 3 is, again, looking at barriers to development. So implementing pre-zoning which I'd noted earlier, and continuing to streamline the development approvals process. We know a lot of that work is underway, but one of the areas we'd be looking at is also innovations in that. So things like using artificial intelligence. We've reached out to Kelowna to get more insight onto their program, but haven't heard back from them yet to schedule an interview. So that is one of the case studies that we'll be looking at. Strategy 4 is to promote equity and inclusion in housing initiatives. Continue to partner with organizations. Partner with organizations addressing homelessness to strengthen services. Looking at adopting adaptable housing standards for accessibility and new multifamily units. Strengthening connections with newcomer and Indigenous housing and service providers. This was a big part of the community engagement feedback that we received. So some examples of that, for example, in Surrey, the city partners with the Surrey Urban Indigenous Leadership Committee. And so the city is sort of an umbrella organization that provides them an opportunity to apply for funding, and the committee itself operates to advocate to senior government, to build capacity within the nonprofit sector, and to do other work related to poverty and housing for Indigenous residents of Surrey. And then finally, supporting housing initiatives for underserved demographics, and those are started to outline in the draft roadmap document and will be kind of explored in depth. So for example, single parent families, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous households are some of the key ones. We know renters obviously are really pressured, but continuing to support those initiatives. And then finally, ongoing advocacy and education. So one of the areas that we've seen an opportunity is to promote new funding for housing to developers and to the public. So, what are the opportunities out there through, for example, the federal government's new budget announcement, through some of the existing programs that the BC government offers. BC Builds is a new opportunity that's focused on missing middle income housing. So really filling that gap from not deep subsidy, but moderate to middle earning households that are increasingly pressured in the housing market. And then, there's been some revitalization to some federal programs like the apartment construction financing program. And then, ongoing advocacy to senior government for infrastructure planning and resources, for further affordable housing investments, for stronger rental protections at the provincial level, and ongoing action on climate change, which we know is another priority for the city. Finally, other big moves include that don't necessarily fit neatly into these, but maybe overarching pieces include the development of a land strategy, which includes both acquisition and also partnership opportunities. Examining opportunities for an arm's length organization, whether there's viability there or not, and what that might look like from a municipal perspective or potentially a sub-regional perspective if there's a need for partnership with neighboring municipalities. And finally, kind of implementing some new approaches to development approvals, which again, we understand are already underway in the city. So continue to build on that good work. I think that's everything.
Great. Maybe before we open it to questions on the latter half, I'll just speak very briefly to what the next steps look like. So we are here very much today to hear council's thoughts and questions. I appreciate there is going to be a lot of questions on the land economics and the OCP analysis. And I just want to reassure council that you will see elements of that information again quite soon. So we are coming back in May to have more of that type of conversation. So the focus for today is very much on the housing strategy piece. And then when we have clarity from the province on what that housing need regulation looks like, we will be back with both the housing needs report finalized as well as the finalized housing strategies for council's comment and endorsement. So just bear in mind that there's two moving pieces right now. Happy to take comments and questions from all of it, but today is very much focused on that roadmap and housing strategy piece. And with that,
Thanks for the presentation. I think it's something we've been waiting for a while. It's important to everyone on council that we have a housing strategy in place. I'm not sure how this is all going to connect at the end of it, but we'll try to give you what you need to do your job at this point. So I'll open it up for questions. Councillor Schiller.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. And yeah, I just have a few questions to start with. One thing I'm interested in is information on the housing authority idea and the BC Builds program from the perspective of a municipality that does not have a lot of land to contribute. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around, are these ideas that would work for us specifically?
Yeah, great questions. BC Builds is a very new program, so we don't know exactly how they're going to roll it out, much like many of the questions that we have about what's happening provincially. But one of the things that I'm personally reassured by is the fact that they're looking at provincial lands for this. So it's not the municipality has to give it up. Yes, some of the initial projects they announced were, so the Gibson's project that made the first announcement was one that I'm from Gibson, so our local housing society was working on for years, and they got second phase funding. That was a municipal parcel, but they're looking at health authority lands, they're looking at school district lands, anything where the province has a purview, or where they have an agency or an organization that is provincial by nature and possesses land, may be up for development opportunities. So increasingly we're seeing health authorities stepping forward for their own staff, but also thinking about the big picture of like, what about residents? And we know that they're landholders in school districts as well. School districts are currently limited by legislation to only be able to house staff and teachers. However, that's being opened up. Some of the early work that other communities have done, I think in Victoria and elsewhere, have looked at opportunities on school district land. Another area where we're seeing increased interest, and certainly I think BC Builds is looking, is underutilized nonprofit or faith community land. So how can those be activated to redevelop for the purposes of their current landholders, so potentially a new church space or faith space for the faith community that also combines with housing. And so those are projects that I think we look at, because when I say a housing or a land strategy, yes, land acquisition is potentially a part of it, or looking at municipal lands, but so are partnerships with community organizations that possess land but may not have it developed and may not actually have the development expertise, where a partnership with the city or an alignment with a provincial funding program like BC Builds could be really beneficial to kind of move things along. So I think, I understand concern, not every municipality, some municipalities have more land than others. And so I think when we talk about a land strategy, it really is about evaluating land across the community and thinking about the partnerships that are going to lead to success. I think, sorry, does that answer all of your questions? Or?
It's good. Can you just tell me a little bit more about a housing authority and
Sure.
how that maybe differs from like having a planning department? And it's not a term I'm super.
So the housing authorities that we know, Whistler Housing Authority is the most well-known and longest established in BC that we know of, and then Vancouver also has an affordable housing authority. Typically what that is it's an arm's length third-party organization, often with a board that's appointed by council, although that varies as well. And it almost differs from community to community how they're rolled out. And in the case of Whistler, they were able to take advantage of huge land developments that were happening in the 90s and capitalize on them by asking for contributions from developers, contributions of land, and then building. And through that, they were able to start an affordable home ownership program, as well as an affordable rental program for residents of Whistler. The new housing authority that Burnaby has proposed, and which is in the process of being incorporated, Burnaby is a very land-rich community, so they've got quite a lot. And what they're looking at is opening up their lands, but going beyond just sending out an RFP and seeing who responds, but taking an active role in the development of that land through partnership with the private sector and the nonprofit sector. So their goal is very much to essentially catalyze development, right? Where they see nonprofit housing development happening, but happening very slowly. They want to help expedite things and move things along. So that's the role that they see themselves taking. And then, a land trust is a slightly different model again, without going too far into it. There are American models of land trust that have a very interesting governance model. The ones that we have in BC right now don't yet have that style of governance model. There's a CLT that operates through Vancouver, and they partner with the City of Vancouver and other municipalities to develop new co-op housing new rental housing and new non-market housing, and sometimes in partnership with the market component as well. So these are all, slightly different variations on the same thing, but fundamentally what we're talking about is the potential for an arm's length organization. Now, there are pros and cons to this. It does come with resource investments that are required, and in Burnaby, they're banking their success effectively on the fact that they have a lot of land. So that, in and of itself is what's setting them up for success. So it's more sort of I think that the strategy is not going to say Maple Ridge has to do this to be successful. It's going to say, could this be a part of the broader set and suite of strategies and policies that Maple Ridge takes on to continue to push forward on housing?
My last very specific question goes back to the report that was part of the agenda. And there was just a part in there, I believe it was under like the regulations and streamlining regulations section where it talked about additional costs being imposed on development through the STEP code. I just wanted to ask a little bit about that, and I assume that's referring to the energy STEP code, but I just wanted, is that the case?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, could we just going forward just specifically specify that it's the energy STEP code, just because I think there's a few different STEP codes on it. Okay, good, thanks. I'm just gonna mull that for a few minutes.
We haven't heard from Councillor Doze, so we'll go with you first and then Councillor Tan.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. But please forgive me if I will take you back a little bit, where the slide that you showed the viability of the threshold, that is 9 to 12% threshold for development. I don't know if you're able to take us back to that location, because I wanted to ask, I needed some level of elucidation on what was presented. I just want to be sure that I got actually, I confirm that what it is what I saw. Yes, here. Here. No, go back. This, yes.
Okay.
If you look at the last scenario, that is a scenario F, what does the viability threshold 9 to 12% mean?
So I apologize, I'm not a land economist, I'm a housing planner, so I hope I can answer this in detail, but there are different measures of viability for a purpose-built rental development as opposed to a market strata development. So market strata developers are typically looking for 15 percentage points rate of return on their investment. And so if they can achieve that, then they get the go-ahead from their financer. In terms of purpose-built rental, we look at different measures. And so this is I believe what's known as the internal rate of return, the IRR, over a period of time. And so that IRR threshold for purpose-built rental typically is sitting in the 9 to 12%. Any below that over a period, I believe it's measured over a period of 10 years for essentially a developer that would develop and hold for a minimum of 10 years. And if they don't see that 9% return, then they would consider and probably their financiers would consider their development.
So in other words, what I'm seeing here is that under the current market condition, that market rental apartment projects is not viable in Maple Ridge. Could that statement be right or wrong?
That's correct, yeah, until you start to layer on both incentives and favorable financing from federal government.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. And thank you so much for the presentation. Really, really interesting. Really appreciate it too, like the focus on the core housing need and folks who are in most need to support you, because I think that's the kind of focus that we need in Maple Ridge. So really, really appreciated the focus and report on that. And also the breakdown of equity considerations. I didn't know that single mother-led households were at 30.3% of the core of the households in core housing need. Like that's really good to know. So, and I appreciated the data-driven policy answers too. Like I didn't know that it was the parking requirements of 40% that made that much of a difference. And going down 6 months in the fast tracking doesn't moves it by not much, So I think this is the kind of stuff that I'm really looking for, and I think that will help us as we, as council goes through and figures out what kinds of policies we're going to ask staff to spend their valuable time on. This is super helpful. I've got sort of, I think, three buckets of things here. The first one I want to look at was the core housing projections. I saw in the report that we're looking at 4,160 households in core housing need as of 2021, so like the most recent numbers we have. I'm curious if we know what the projection is over the next, say, 30 years. So the reason why I'm asking is because if I see 4,160 core housing household core housing need, my first question is how are we going to fulfill all 4,000 of them? And then what's the growth over the next few years? And that we have to account for as well.
So yeah, that's an excellent question. And we, under the current HNR legislation, we're not required to project out core housing need. However, we can as part of the analysis. So we'll make a note of that to include that in the projection section if that's of interest to council. But I think there are a few things that need to be considered when it comes to addressing core housing need. The first is that we know core housing need is this strong indicator of household vulnerability, but we also know that there's a subset of folks who are in extreme core housing need who are the most vulnerable, most likely to be vulnerable to homelessness, living paycheck to paycheck, experiencing other forms of housing vulnerability. When it comes to sort of calculating some of the need, we cannot assume that everybody in core housing need needs a new unit, because that might lead to an overproduction of units, particularly when we have good data from this last census period that shows how impacted renter households who are more vulnerable are by changes to income supports. So we actually saw core housing need go down in the last census in a lot of communities, particularly amongst renters, because of the CERB benefit, which is a direct income intervention. So we don't necessarily need to only build our way out of the solution. We do need a supply side approach, particularly for vulnerable households, but arguably the households that are most in need, that is those in extreme core housing need, are the ones that need new units that are quite affordable. And then other households may need new units, but they may also need other forms of support, income supports, additional sort of attainable living supports. So we can certainly project out core housing need over the next probably 20 years, because I think that's the threshold at which the report is going to be looking at timeframes, and do a little bit of a breakdown. But I think when it comes to the projections too, in theory, and this is very theoretical, if we were to build an equitable distribution of housing across the income continuum for all of our new builds, then that would help support no new core housing need. And then it would be a matter of drawing down the existing core housing need through additional affordable units. So that would be kind of the targeted solution, I think, would be to bring those things together. But the volume, that's a very high volume. And of course, we're seeing from the analysis that like, if purpose-built rental housing is having a hard time getting viability, then that makes it that much harder for non-market housing to get viability within the market. So what that tells us is that big investments from senior government are necessary to support on the real affordability side. And we can make some of that happen through the financing like CMHC offers, where you can get a portion of those units. But if we want to make inroads on the thousands of households in Maple Ridge or in other communities that are in core housing need or even an extreme core housing need, it will require significant senior government investment. And I don't think there's any way of getting it.
Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. And I think it's a good reminder that the senior government intervention. And I think so, like, in terms of where we sit at council, right? When we look at what kind of vision that we have for our community, this council set up to be bold and ambitious. So really, when in terms of core housing need, yes, there's all the practicalities we need to and the strategies to sort out. Really, our goal is to draw the core housing need number down to zero. Like end zero over the next 20 years. So my question is, what can we do to make that happen? And then if, whatever strategies we need in order to make that happen, let's lay it out on the table, right? And then in terms of, I think what I'm looking for is it's very clear metrics around, this is a great conversation about what tactics that we need to have and what that may be favorable to council. My largest point is whatever draws it down to zero. If you're telling me that fast tracking development applications or whatever, is not the thing, like this is this other thing, I'm down with that. Just whatever it is to draw it down to zero. So, and if we're clear that we're not going to draw it down to zero, I'm looking for sort of clear data around that. We do policies A, B, C, and F. We bring that core housing need down to 1,500, and we project a lower increase if we do other things, a lower increase in the future if we do these other things. So that's the kind of, I don't know if that level of data is possible, but that's what I'm looking for. And so in terms of like really what I'm looking for in our implementation plan is these core metrics, what is the core housing need? How many households? How do we increase rental vacancy? And so I think what I would really appreciate your help and staff's help on this is what kind of metrics can we use to ensure that the housing strategy that we're putting forward is like really addresses, what is felt on the street, which is my life getting any better or not? So like just that sort of what I'm looking for really is really the key point of that is like clear metrics and a timeline, so we know on council if we do these things, this is out as best as we can get. This is the core housing need number. This is the rental vacancy number that we end up at. And I think that's good for me for now, Mayor.
Thank you. We've got Councilor Carreras followed by Councilor Youssef.
Just a couple of questions. Some are just kind of like notes for going forward. There's no page numbers on here, but it's the piece around strengthening connections with newcomer and Indigenous housing and service providers. It talks about partnering with Katzie First Nation and Kwantlen First Nation, and I would just really encourage you, considering the majority of the Indigenous population is urban Indigenous from all across Canada, a significant portion, that I would encourage you to add FRIS in there, which is the Fraser River Indigenous Society, which is a great organization, and actually GEMS as well, which is the Golden Years Métis Society. I would encourage that Katzie First Nation and Kwantlen First Nation, of course, is really important to partner with as well, but the majority of the urban and Indigenous folks.
Yeah, can I respond to
Yeah.
that one? One of the, absolutely, and I think we can integrate that for sure. I do want to note that the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo First Nations now have a new development corporation called Sacred Waters, who are actually working with the Surrey Urban Indigenous Leadership Committee too. And one of their big mandates is housing, and it's housing for their membership, but it's also broader housing for urban Indigenous folks. So that is an area, and that's sort of why they were suggested, because they've got this vehicle now for driving development forward that may be part of the solution as well.
Okay, perfect. But I would encourage you to be broader in especially in the reports. The inclusionary zoning piece. So Metro Vancouver just released a report a couple of months ago around inclusionary zoning that wasn't very favorable for areas in the further out you went, the more difficult it was to do that. Now, is this a report that you're going to be relying on, or are you looking at something different so we can see how the two line up when you're looking at those?
Well, I mean, we'll be doing a testing on inclusionary zoning as part of the memo that's an appendix to the report. So determining the feasibility in comparison to density bonusing, which again is that sort of incentive-based approach.
Yeah, it was interesting reading that report because you're like, oh wow, okay, that it's great for things like but there's such a need in our community, and so the challenge, and I think Councillor Tan's talked about, is how do we meet that need when some of the levers that other communities have we don't have here, and I'd say the need could possibly be greater. Can we just talk a little bit about the density bonusing piece, and maybe it's just me sharing for as we go forward and we start looking at deep dive in policy. I feel, and again, like maybe just because I'm new and we haven't dealt with this a lot, I feel like the density bonusing is this all-inclusive, throw paint at a wall type bonusing, and I feel it's not, and again, it might just be me because I'm new and I've worked a lot in it, and I almost feel like everywhere in our community has this access to density bonusing, whether it's appropriate or not, and I'm wondering as we go forward, is it better for us? Because again, there are areas where the density makes sense, and that's where we should really focus our energy in. But I'm curious to know what sort of, and again, we've lost a lot of the density bonusing pieces in those areas that we want to build up because of the new legislation with the TOAs and stuff. So when you're talking about density bonusing, what are some of the areas that we actually still can look at and with encouraging developers into those areas where the density makes the most sense and not the outlying areas?
I might provide a little bit of context, and then you can speak to how it's going to be incorporated in this document. So within the city, we have density bonus programs that have come in at a number of different points in time over the years, right? The rates aren't current to 2024. Albion has a very different program than the major corridor program, and we've used it as well in some other circumstances to kind of facilitate the city's objectives at that point in time. at a very high level, it can be very broad. And when available, we have used it to the council's priorities of the day. And regardless of Bill 44 and the housing legislation that's coming in, we really were in 2024 hoping to kind of do a hard reset on what density bonusing looks like going forward. So the work that would be tied into this piece isn't necessarily saying that the existing ones are going to stay. They're probably going to look very different. Some areas may not have density bonus moving forward. Other new areas may get it. And what that exactly looks like is the piece that's going to come forward. We just acknowledge that it's a bit of a piecemeal right now. This is the intention to clean it up and use it appropriately so we do get the types of density where we want it in the housing forms that we would like to see.
Okay, good. So because I haven't worked with it that much, so I felt it was a little, so I'm glad that we're sort of refocusing that, bringing it up to today's, because we are going to have more challenges. And I think one of the challenges when there is such a focus and some, I think there's a lot of pressure on municipalities to jump into the affordable housing ring. We are a community that doesn't have a lot of land. I actually don't know what provincial land there is. The school district is in the perfect spot to build up, and I know that's an interest of theirs, but that may be the only property they can look at. But it'll be interesting to see where we have those pieces, and it seems like in the density bonusing and the change to the ACCs, we've lost our ability to collect funding for affordable housing too. In the new stream
Through ACCs.
Yeah, the ACCs still exclude that. So going from the CACs to ACCs, we can no longer do that. So are there creative maybe you can build in ways that other communities are looking at the supportive or the affordable housing piece and how municipalities can participate in that without.
And maybe to start with your earlier question, you can see here on the map, I know it's very small, so I apologize for that, but this area here, so this is outside of transit oriented areas, but part of the growth corridor.
Oh, sorry.
So this whole area, and this is one of the areas that we're testing right now for the incentives, but also we'll be testing for the density bonusing pieces as well, just because it is most targeted towards growth. In terms of the ability to capture affordable housing, I think that's an excellent question. I think through density bonusing that still can be acquired, but it's going to be a very site to site exploration. So for example, Coquitlam, one of their recent projects that we were talking with them about, they had a larger development going through. It was a market strata development, but as a function of the density bonusing that they received, they also got financing from CMHC to build a purpose-built rental building on site with a component of affordability. There may be other opportunities, and it's a little bit harder to partner with BC Housing because of the nature of their funding calls and the length of time it can take, but it's not impossible.
And would Coquitlam still be able to get that density bonusing that they got under the new legislation?
From my understanding, yes.
It would, okay.
It's just the ACCs that they couldn't then apply on it, right? So it's where it becomes part of their density bonusing program, they can ask for it.
Yeah, but my understanding is where some of it is because they removed, like we would say, you know, you could the density bonusing to go up, and because the province has said there's a minimum of 10 or 8 or stories, and we probably can't go, depending on our soil, we may not be able to go much higher than that, so we lose that. Whereas before, if we were going to 8 stories, we would have the density bonusing, but because the province has removed that from us, we miss that. So
I think the context, that would very much have to be outside of the TOAs. So we'd be looking at the density that's like on the peripheries of the TOAs in other growth nodes, but yes, acknowledging that the province has taken away some of that ability to decision make.
And then just one last thing, Mayor, and then I'm done. Thank you for your patience. 3.1, prioritize needed forms of housing. When you're looking at transitional housing, additional supportive housing, and youth housing and support, I'm assuming that when you start to look at that, you're going to look at how we compare to the region as well, and where that real need is. I'm hearing, when we go into our supportive housing, we already have 3, which I think is actually, when you look at the housing data book, is quite high for our community. But what we're hearing a lot of times is that next level of housing is really important because the supportive housing is full and they can't move. People that are ready to move on can't move on to the next level of housing to be able to take more in And so if there's, when you're looking at that, if there's any ideas how we can encourage that next level, I mean, I think a lot of it is senior levels of government, but ways that we can partner with them, encourage them, I think that next level of housing is really integral for the folks in our community. Thank you.
Councillor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff and to Urban Matters for the report and presentation. My feedback on this is I hope there was a consideration for the growth, the significant growth that our municipality is experiencing, and as we're looking toward the future, that there also will be further consideration to a possible redrawing of our urban containment boundaries and the housing that will come in or that we will be able to bring online. Of course, considering the infrastructure that we have in place and what would be needed and what capacities we can offer when we're putting together this strategy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's my feedback.
Okay, Councillor Schiller.
Just in terms of some general feedback, I don't have a ton to add, but just in terms of like going through the agenda and listening to the presentation today, you know, I do really appreciate the data driven approach, and I think it's interesting. We had ideas that fast track was going to have a big impact. I actually see the parking thing as being such a gift, because in the grand scheme of things, it seems like a very simple, achievable change that can have a big measurable difference. So that's something I'm very in favor of. I just want to see us as a municipality just focus the majority of our efforts on non-market housing. You know, we need to create a better ecosystem throughout for everyone to get more housing built, but I think that's our focus, and that's where it needs to be. And so I am definitely in favor of, you know, innovative ideas and trying new things. But I also, you know, acknowledge that I think our municipality is just sort of becoming more involved in housing and development. This is early days for us, and I just think it's important to sort of take it like one step at a time. Like, I would love for us to be able to do one successful project with a nonprofit, and then, you know, in the next year and get that done and learn from that, and then take those lessons forward into further work. And so I'm just hoping I can strike that balance. That's it.
Thank you, and back to Councillor Tan.
Thanks for the round two, Mayor, and I'll keep my comments brief. I'm just going to riff off of Councillor Schiller's points here about sort of the you know, the one mixed project with our with a non-market housing partner. I really appreciate the framework and the laying of the foundation, the big picture thinking here that Urban Matters and staff presented. I think it's so important as we look for in the long term, and I really appreciated the approach we used with the mayor's task force on climate, where we said, you know, while that large plan for climate is being built out, here are the shorter term high impact actions that we can take for climate. And I think through the mayor's task force, we really rolled out a lot of significant things that this municipality will tackle. And I wonder what that looks like for housing. So building on Councillor Schiller's points, you know, in the next 6 months, you know, what can we do? You know, before we build out the big moves for land strategy or whatever, when the next 6 months, what can we do? And you know, Councillor Carreras and I were talking, we said, you know, we've done lots of great stuff with the BC Housing is looking at the new seniors, or at new seniors housing building, and that's wonderful. And I wonder if there's sort of a two-part for this, where, you know, staff probably have this metric somewhere of like all the new housing starts for non-market or stuff, that layer of housing for equity deserving communities. And the other piece I would love to get both staff and the consultants' feedback is like those shorter term, let's punch them, let's hit them, and then let's hit those results. So I think that's the piece that I would love to see in the implementation report as well. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, well, thank you very much to staff and to your presentation. I think we still have a lot of work to do. Look forward to what's the next step in this process and how we get forward. It's clear that we just can't jump in and start throwing darts all over a wall. We do need to have a strategy. So I think council is looking forward to what that's going to look like. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the next item. And that is 5.2. council chambers policy. Run away.
Do it without a slide.
Carolyn can speak. Okay.
So before you, you have a draft policy for the use of council chambers. Before COVID, it used to be used by some local groups. Significant investments were made in the technology to get us through COVID and continue to have electronic meetings, which are now permitted under the legislation and is increasing our participation as we often get people participating virtually. I think wasn't planned, but as you can see today, how easy it is for the technology to get bumped by a chair and messes things up. And I also have lived experience of having outside user groups. They just don't recognize or don't, you know, a bump of a cable can mess us up. So the recommendation is to restrict the use to just council committees and staff. I did speak with 4 other municipalities: Burnaby, Vancouver, Fraser Valley, and Township of Langley. None of them do offer the rental of their council chambers. And the only one that does is Surrey, but they are purpose-built as a theater. Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, are we able to get that, the policy up on the screen or?
No.
No.
Maybe,
Okay, well, you guys figure that piece out. Obviously, this has been coming to us. There are the few organizations there's a bunch of organizations that are looking for places to host their meetings and what have you. And it's why this is important to come up with a policy, whatever that policy might be. It's important to be able to have a policy that we can refer to, so it doesn't become the wild, wild west of anybody who wants to come into chambers, that sort of thing. So I will open it up for questions.
see the people.
I can't see the people, but I do see, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do have some
Councilor
questions,
Schiller?
so I'm happy to go back. I don't mind waiting if people are.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, we're gonna do this.
I just
I'll give you a minute.
There, now you can see.
There's the people. Okay, so I've just been thinking about this a bit, and I just want to make sure I sort of understand what has happened in the past, because I have been thinking back to times when outside groups have been using either meeting rooms or council chambers specifically. And so in the past, outside groups are able to use council chambers without any city staff present. Is that correct?
Afraid I don't know the answer to that question. I would find it hard to believe. I mean, the building needs to be secure during the evenings, and I'm pretty sure we don't just hand out the passcode to the comment or the combinations. So I wouldn't think so, but I can speak to that for sure.
No, I mean, that is literally one of the things I was thinking about. I was like, well, how do the doors get locked at the end? Like, I'm just trying to understand what the level of support was that we provided in the past and how we're.
Some of these groups, Councillor, were unaccompanied by staff. They were provided either key code into the building, that time delays out, and then by the time you punch out, you're able to leave out of certain corridors. So it's been very loose in the way that controls City Hall, and especially onto the city network for security has been why staff have raised concerns in the advent of before COVID. There was no monitors. There was a standard microphone. You literally just logged your flash drive in, plugged in the computer that was there, up your running. The city has invested significantly into changing all of the screens so that everything that is shown on the screens goes through a network, which is on our side of the firewall. And so there's a large IT investment that was made in during COVID to allow council to perform its functions remotely and through hybrid. And so as a result of that, the city's invested, as I said, heavily into the technology piece of that. I think the other philosophical conversation that I think you need to have a workshop is, you know, who do you want having access to your council chambers? The Parks and Recreation through our facility allocation policies and our fee schedules have access to almost every other facility within our inventory that people can use and people can rent. And there's a process to be able to do that. Council chambers has always been one of those ones where it's been an anomaly because we don't normally put it into the facility allocation where people can phone up and say, I'd like to book your council chambers, except for those municipalities that are in theaters. Abbotsford is one where they use the Arts Theatre. Surrey is the example where it's purpose built. So it comes down to how free does council want to be with protecting some of those components for not only just the integrity of the organization, but also the purpose of council performing its business.
And have we looked at what costs would be, like whether if outside organizations were able to use council chambers but had to pay the cost for staff to be there to supervise or have additional insurance, like do we have any idea of what those costs would be?
We would need to quantify what those requirements were per group. Predominantly, it would have to be at least one member of staff that had IT background to be able to hook up. If they're requiring to be able to put things on our firewall to be able to produce a PowerPoint or watch a video or do some type of component, even on the microphones, we would need to have probably a person of IT and maybe one person of security that were there. So those costs would be borne by taxpayers, and that would be something we'd have to quantify as we go through a process, some type of rental agreement for us of insurance.
From the insurance side, I've experience in that it's very difficult for these small user groups to get that type of insurance that we would require.
Okay. We'll go to Councilor Youssef next. Well, his hand was up before yours, but it was hiding behind the wall. He was firewalled. Go ahead, Councilor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to move the recommendation.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to keep Councilor Carreras.
We're going to discuss it first before moving it.
Oh, he's moved it, so
Yeah, we're not that formal in workshop, but if you're moving the motion, can I get a seconder? Seconded by Councilor Schiller. Now open it. Did you have any comments to it? Do you want to speak to it at all, Councilor Youssef?
I agree with staff's recommendation that council chambers should be while it is alternately the space for the public. I'm sure the city can offer other facilities where public groups can meet and hold their events rather than council chambers that does have a significant amount of sensitivity around it, especially when we're looking at the IT and having to put in the firewalls, having to have staff present to ensure that the integrity of chambers, both electronically and physically, are maintained. So I'm quite comfortable with what staff are recommending for this policy. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for the work they've done on this.
Thank you, Councilor Carreras.
Okay, so kind of like Councilor Schiller, where I've done a lot of thinking about this over the last little while as we've been getting requests, and part of me, I find it really hard to say no to a public space being accessible to the public. I struggle with that, but I also understand that there's been significant technology upgrades to the facility, and part of those technology upgrades, as I really delve into it, are to allow for participation in the democratic process. It allows for folks, as we see today, they're able to participate remotely. And who does that impact the most? It impacts women, it impacts, equity-seeking groups. We get a younger demographic at the table because they're able to easier balance work and electronics. So as much as I hate technology in the council, and I'm not shy about saying I don't think technology makes a better council meeting, I do recognize it allows for participation of folks, and that is important for me as well as I balance that with a public building being accessible to the community. I really truly want to see younger voices and women and equity seeking groups at the table making the decisions. That's a real priority for me. I do wonder if there was a cost recovery model that included, so there was the total cost of the staff included, the whatever staff time to process it, you know, would it be possible to rent it out if there was a cost recovery where the group that was renting it paid the full cost recovery for the staffing and everything? Is that a possibility?
So from staff's end of things, this is a council decision, it's a council policy. Council decides to go one way, staff will work to operationalize council's wishes.
I mean, I'm fine to pass the policy now, but I would like some further investigation into, first of all, I think that all, you know, we do have a fee schedule for all of our buildings for rent, and I don't think that chamber should be excluded from it if we allow people in there. I also think that it should be on a cost recovery. Where I come from that is when we have children living in poverty that still have to pay 25% of their fees to participate in recreation, that I don't want to be subsidizing groups until we have that looked after. Yeah, I'm fine to support it today, but I would be curious to know what a cost recovery is. The other thing is there's been, you know, outside of the technology pieces, most of the seats have been removed. Like, there's actually not even many seats in the front anyhow to be able to do whatever it's being rented for to participate. So anyhow, those are my rambling thoughts on that. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mayor. Yeah, I agree a lot with what has been said, and I think I'm curious. Like, I just want to say to you that I think all of us are really grateful to community groups for putting on these events, and then I think we all come from this understanding that, you know, like, space is really hard to rent and can be really expensive, and so I wonder, you know, and the technological, I think, concerns are very real and very valid for council chambers. So I wonder, what are the alternatives necessarily that we could suggest to groups? You know, I think about the groups that have approached us in the past that are, you know, strapped for cash because it is a tough, you know, it's a tough economy out there and rents are expensive. I wonder maybe if we can satisfy the need of those groups, for space in a more creative fashion. I wonder maybe if we could it could be something like providing a list of, you know, all the event spaces at Albion and all the different community centers that we have, you know, the different community spaces we have, and then sort of like, to Councillor Carrera's point, some sort of a cost recovery model where we're not charging them no one's making a profit out of these groups, but just to make sure that taxpayers are not subsidizing use of space. I think really where I'm trying to get at is folks have a valid need for space, and there are spaces. I just want to see if we can play a more facilitating role to making sure that groups can have access. I don't know if staff have any suggestions around that for playing that sort of facilitator type of role.
So some suggestions were made, such as the library, for instance, and I'm not sure what the library fee is. It's not a lot of money, but even the library, if you're going to rent a room, you actually do have to have insurance. The organization would still have to have insurance. You know, the question becomes more of, do we allow it, or do we allow it for a fee, or do we allow it for free? And that's where you get the slippery slope, because if you start saying, you know, okay, well, this organization will get it for free, where is the next organization that comes in who wants it for free, and the next one who wants it for free, and the next one? There's more than enough organizations out there who are all looking for meeting space, and like I said, the library does have their 2 rooms that they do rent out for a nominal fee, and you know, so it becomes like anything else. We want to have a policy that makes sense and applies to basically everybody, right?
Yeah.
So when we look at this, that's a decision that we have to come up with, right? If we want to rent it out, then we have to look at not just the cost of security, not just the cost of of a staffer, but then how many more organizations?
Yeah.
Then you're starting to add that into the mix, and this could be very costly to us if we're the ones who are carrying the shoulder of that cost. Scott?
Just for council's awareness as well, Parks and Recreation, our facilities division, does have a fee-for-service program through our facility booking clerks for members of the public and users of the public and community groups to be able to access public spaces that are owned and operated by the municipality. Many of those are at subsidized rates. Some of them are at cost recovery, and that is baked into your fee schedule that council approves every year when the Parks and Recreation fee structure comes in place. So as an example, youth groups and nonprofits get a subsidized rate that's far below the actual asset class value and the cost of maintaining those pieces. Commercial venues, commercial rentals of public space like our hockey arenas or swimming pools and our meeting rooms pay an expropriated rate based on what that valuation is. On a formula that's baked into the philosophy of how the fee structure is put together. So there are spaces within the city's inventory where nonprofit groups and groups that are seeking subsidy can get those pieces. To the mayor's point, they do require insurance. Many of these groups are incorporated. They have a nonprofit society status. So that is just us making sure that we're preparing and protecting taxpayers' best interests as we allow public spaces to be used by other nonprofits or NGOs or for private businesses. And that is all part of the existing facility allocation strategy that Parks and Recreation has under their purview. It's just a reminder from council. The one exception is council chambers. And that is because it's an area where council conducts its business. And that is one area currently that we do not have into that facility allocation policy.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman, and thank you, Mayor. And I really agree with you that I think that there needs to be that fair, consistent policy across all these community groups, so everyone has a clear level of understanding that they can just read on the website. This is what the policy is, and I would be excited to if we put. I think the larger question here is where can community groups meet? And then I think as long as I would be comfortable with this policy of not allowing groups to use the council chambers because of all the concerns you've identified, and I think that my larger question is how can we, maybe it's just as simple as a communications piece when folks email us, that we can just provide, hey, this is a list of other spaces you can provide, so that we continue to play our role as a welcoming, thank you for doing the great work you do in the community. Here are the spaces you can use. Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks. Any further comments?
Just to say that as we move forward, and I think it's already been captured in the Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, is there is a real need for community space. And as we move forward on the new recreation aquatic facility, wherever it ends up and whatever it looks like, I have heard from youth groups that they need a space to meet, and we hear from other organizations that need a space to meet. And maybe for all of us as we go forward, we need to remember that and keep it as a priority as we look at building out whatever the new recreation and aquatic facility looks like. And and if it's a space that's accessible by transit and more in the center, the challenge with Albion is it's a little far out for folks that don't drive. But depending on where the new aquatic facility ends up, it may be closer to transit. It might be actually a place to really investigate a meeting space or a performance space or something. Thanks.
Okay. Seeing no further questions or comments, shall we take a vote? All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor of this policy? Any opposed? One opposed? Councilor Youssef, were you in favor or opposed?
In favor, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so it's unanimous. Motion has been carried. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any more. Adjournment. Okay. Since now we have no further business, we are adjourned. Thank you.